Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim Gates from Michigan State University. I have participated in this conference for the last, actually probably since the very first one. Was it now 6 years ago, 5 years ago now? This is the sixth conference. I enjoy being here, even though I'm not really technically affiliated with the UTC anymore. It's always good to be here and present. What I'm presenting today is actually a refresh. If you've been here coming to these conferences annually, you'll notice that this is, if you remember, it's fairly similar to a presentation that I gave a few years ago. It's more or less a refresh of that, largely with data now. So some before and after data that we're seeing related to the speed limit changes that occurred in 2017 in Michigan. So unless you've lived under a rock for the last few years, you've probably been aware of the ongoing speed limit policy debate. And it's not just here in Michigan, it's nationwide. So the bottom line is that speed limits have been going up and up and up ever since the repeal of the national maximum speed limit back in 1995. And so if you go out west, I mean, you're looking at speed limits that are on the order of 80 miles an hour. Even in Texas, there's a particular section of roadway for which the Texas DOT actually changed their design standards in order to build that has a speed limit of 85 miles an hour. But many western states are now on the limited access freeway system, the interstate system, rural interstate system are now at 80 miles an hour. It's not just rural. If you look in some urban areas, especially out west, Utah even has their urban freeways posted up to 70 miles per hour. Now you say, well, we do have some urban classified freeways here in Michigan that are 70, and that's certainly true. But our urban freeways and our dense urban core areas, like in downtown Detroit, the Lodge Freeway, and some of those are still certainly not designed for 70. They're still posted at 55, no lower than 55, but it's somewhere on the order of 55 to 65 miles per hour, depending on the design. Ohio recently went from 65 to 70 on their interstates, on their limited access freeways. This was probably only about 5 years ago or so. Immediately looked into increasing up to 75, and there was pushback. Pushback largely from the truck lobby that said, look, we are not, the large commercial truckers are not interested in having their trucks travel faster than 68 miles per hour because that's where, from a cost effectiveness standpoint, is best. So they have governors or limiters on their trucks, and many fleets do somewhere on the order of 65 to 70 miles per hour. But in Ohio, they said, look, and our tires aren't rated for that highest speeds either, so there's no reason to go up to 75. And then that came back off the table. So Ohio's still capped at 70. Oregon is one of the few states. Now, many of the states will tell you that they're monitoring speeds and have a clause to actually roll those speed limits back if, in fact, they do find safety issues. And Oregon is the only state of the 25 that have increased speed limits in the last several years to actually roll back speed limits on, these are on highway, not freeways, but just normal undivided highways out in rural areas. They actually did roll them back after they had 2 fatal crashes on a particular section of highway that they deemed were speed related. So they rolled those back, I believe, from 65 miles per hour back to the original 55 or 60 mile per hour limit that existed 6 months prior. And of course in Michigan, may or may not have been aware that the original debate was on going up to 80 miles an hour. And that got a lot of pushback. This was back in 2014. It was originally introduced as a bill that would raise speed limits on select rural freeways to 80 miles an hour. That went back to committee and then resurfaced in 2016, I believe, with a 75 mile per hour maximum limit on freeways and a 65 mile per hour maximum limit on select non-freeway highways. So 2-lane highways like US 2 and M28 in the Upper Peninsula, some of our really low populated areas, that was on the ballot as well. So again, I said, so about half the states, about 25 states since 2011 have increased their speed limits. If you look here, it's not just freeways. There are several states highlighted in bold here that did increase speed limits on state highways. So 2-lane and 4-lane highways, divided or undivided. So it's not just limited to the limited access freeway system, the interstates. although those have seen increases certainly as well. You'll also notice a lot of select. So whereas post-national maximum speed limit, when the speed limits were raised generally statutorily across the system, network-wide, we're now seeing cases where it's like, well, we'll go out and do an engineering study and select locations that are appropriate, that can handle these higher speed limits. Okay, and that might include looking at the 85th percentile speed or the speed distributions on those sections, the geometry, other risk-related factors. And that's especially important on our non-freeway system. The freeway system is a little bit easier, believe it or not, from a selection standpoint. It's the 2-lane and 4-lane highways that are a little bit more difficult, where the geometry is more challenging and you have driveways and towns and schools and all that sort of thing. So if we look at the change in speed limits from 2012 to 2018, we see that shift in the darker color, darker shading, and that indicates a shift to higher speed limits. So we see it's not just out west, we see it's also east of the Mississippi, and we see that Michigan and Maine are now the only two states that have freeway speed limits that exceed 70 miles per hour. The Midwest into the south, east of the Mississippi, is exclusively 70, with the exception of Michigan. And then the Northeast, where things tend to be more condensed, densely populated areas, we have fewer true rural freeways. We still see 65 mile per hour maximum speed limits on freeways. And again, Michigan and Maine being the only mavericks. If we look at undivided highways between 2012 and 2018, we also see a shift to darker colors. The predominant speed limit, as you'd expect, east of the Mississippi on those highways is 55. Michigan and Florida being the only examples, and Michigan actually leading the way with 65 mile per hour limits on select 2-lane highways. Again, out west in Texas, we are even seeing 75 mile per hour speed limits on undivided highways, which is, in my opinion, insanely high. We don't have many roadways here that could support a 75 mile per hour speed limit off the interstate system. And you can see even 70 miles per hour in the Rocky Mountain states here as well on the 2-lane roadways. What are some of the safety impacts now? So if you look historically in the data, you'll see that during the time when the 55 mile per hour maximum speed limit was in place, between 74 when that first started and 1987, nationwide it was estimated approximately 75. The literature would suggest at least that 7,500 lives were saved annually. Between 1987 and 1995, when that maximum limit was raised to 65 on interstates, on rural interstates, we saw traffic fatalities actually increase by 29%. And then since the complete repeal of the national maximum speed limit in 95, when states were given the full authority to set speed limits, we've seen approximately 12,500 additional fatalities, at least through 2005, that first 10 years since then. If we look at some trends related to speed limits, so if we look at the maximum speed limit allowed within that state on any type of highway, we see very clearly that states with 75 or 80 mile per hour maximum limit, so most of our western states, have higher fatality rates. And again, these are VMT, miles traveled normalized rates here, are higher. Okay, so we see this, it's a kind of a step function here, but we do see in all cases that fatal rates have actually been decreasing regardless of the speed limit. Nevertheless, for those states that have a 75 to 80 mile per hour limit, we do see a rate that's almost double, about double what it is for the states that have a 60 to 65 mile per hour limit. Now these states are vastly different, right? So the states with the 60 to 65 mile per hour limit, again, are those northeastern states we saw on the map, and Hawaii. They're less rural, they're more urban, so less opportunities for really high speeds in most cases. Whereas our western states, this would be pretty much the rest of the country, and then our western states that are very lightly populated, certainly on a density standpoint, population density standpoint, have rural in Montana is vastly different than rural in Massachusetts or rural in Michigan, and I think we all understand that. So looking at interstate fatalities by miles traveled and speed limit, if we again break these up, these top two and then this third one here in the bottom left, 60 to 65, 70 mile per hour limit, 75 mile per hour limit. If we look at the trends between interstate fatalities and speed limit versus mile traveled, we see not only for the highest limit is it higher, but it's also got a steeper slope with respect to miles traveled. Okay, so that's not good. I mean, so again, we're looking at cases where plotting the fatalities by state and by year versus miles traveled, we see that green, which is the highest speed limit category, states with the highest speed limit, 75 and above, had a higher fatal crash rate, fatal crashes with respect to VMT. So any way we look at it, we're seeing this is just slicing the pie a little bit differently. We're seeing a greater crash rate. Why though? So what is it about speed and crash risk? Well, speed and crash risk, this is called the Solomon curve from 1960s. We noticed that if you drive, so this is the variation on the x-axis here, variation from the average speed. We generally find that if we are from about the a mile or two per hour below the average speed up to about 10 miles per hour above the average speed, somewhere in that range is generally the safest. But there's issues with this, and that would occur both day and night. But there's issues with this. And a lot of the issues were associated right in here with turning traffic. So driveways and public access points were contributing to this higher crash rate here. So if you take out the driveway-related crashes and the turning-related crashes, you see it actually flattens out from the whole range of from minus 15 miles per hour below, so 15 miles per hour below the average speed to 15 miles per hour above the average speed, the crash rate really doesn't change much. So this is a modification to the Solomon curve. If Finch back in '94 took a look at, well, if we increase the speed limit by a few miles an hour, or if we increase the average speed on a roadway by a few miles per hour, generally by increasing the speed limit, or if you decrease it, we do see a correlation between the crash rate and the increase in the average speed, okay? And it's correlated in the way that we would expect, that if you increase the average speed, you see more crashes. If you decrease the average speed, you see fewer crashes. And that's across both the United States and in Europe. So just to summarize, if we looked at the literature, summarizing the literature findings, that increases, when we looked at the states that had been increasing speed limits lately, we've seen that, like I stated, that most increases recently have been on select locations. They haven't been system-wide, it's been select locations, and the feasibility is generally based on an engineering study that looks at the 85th percentile speeds and some safety or risk factors. Some states have monitored before and after speed trends. Iowa is a good example of a state that's recently increased speed and looked at before and after on several sites. But there's really hasn't been a lot of before and after crash analysis, and some of that is just due to the amount of time that it takes to gather crashes after that speed limit has been increased. So we didn't have a lot of data to work with, and there really isn't a lot of knowledge about the economic impact. So we know how much it costs to change the number on the sign. But what about putting out new warning signs or chevrons on curves that previously were not deficient design speed-wise, now are deficient, okay? And what about maybe doing some major realignment? When it comes to rebuilding that, you've actually got to realign that curve to be federally compliant. So there are some costs associated with this. So back in 2017, in January of 17, Rick Snyder signed Public Act 455, Governor Rick Snyder, into law, which mandated an increase in speed limit from 70 to 75 on 600 miles of limited access freeways in rural areas, and from 55 to 65 on 900 miles of rural trunk lines. Rural 2-lane and 4-lane highways that were not freeways. And with the language in there, we're supported by an engineering and safety study and the 85th percentile speed of free-flowing traffic under ideal conditions. The truck limit was also raised to 65 miles per hour on all freeways, regardless of whether the car limit went from 70 to 75. And MDOT was mandated that should occur by the end of 2017, so they started rolling them out on May 1, the new speed limits on May 1, and that continued through November of 17. So this was actually a multi-stage process. So remember back in 2014 when I said that the legislature was actually considering the 80 miles per hour limit, and at that point Kirk Steidl decided that it was prudent for MDOT to investigate come up with a candidate list. They knew that it was coming. They knew that they wouldn't be able to stop it, But MDOT thought that if we put together a candidate list, that might actually save us from having the entire state going up to 80. Okay? So we were engaged on a research project to basically come up with a process to select candidates. So what are the factors that should be considered when trying to select highway segments for increased speed limits? And so what we did for MDOT, we came up with a multi-stage process. We handled step 1 and 2, and we allowed MDOT and the state police to handle step 3, which was the collection of the field data. But we aggregated the crash data along with some risk-related data and geometric and cross-sectional related data related to horizontal curvature, medians, passing zones, school locations, the area type, urban versus rural, traffic volumes, truck traffic volumes, the lane widths, shoulder widths, etc. And we came up with a risk model, a risk assessment model. And this paper was published in TRB a few years ago, and I'm not going to go through the details, but we basically looked through the literature and we analyzed the Michigan crash data, and we came up with some thresholds for the primary geometric factors that I just talked about, and also the crash factors, to come up with a list of reasonable segments, candidate segments. Now, there were some data limitations, obviously, and that's why it's important to also have some, we call it boots on the ground, some people out in the field assessing these locations and collecting some actual operating speed data to determine, hey, if people aren't already doing, if the 85th percentile doesn't currently exceed the speed limit, then why would we want to increase it anyways? But looking at locations where people were already traveling at higher speeds, and then, of course, doing an additional assessment of stopping sight distances and that sort of thing, that we didn't have access to that sort of data. So we came up with this map on the left. These were non-freeway locations that we felt were good candidates for an increased speed limit. MDOT took that information and actually ran some additional analyses and had some additional reasons why they might want to apply the higher speed limit in certain areas and not apply it in other areas, and came up with their own map here. Now, I will say this map is actually where the 900 miles came from. So because we were out in front of the legislature, we were able to MDOT was able to take that information and say, we've found 900 miles of candidate roadways that we feel comfortable with, and that actually got written into the law. Okay. Of course, the 900 shifted a little bit from what we'd originally come up with. They really didn't want to implement any of these in southern Michigan. They felt it was more important to look at northern Michigan, where, again, it's fewer people, lower traffic volumes, etc. Now, the freeway map actually does look fairly similar to what we came up with initially. And again, these are 600 miles that we came up with, and of course, 600 miles roughly got implemented. Now, we've also been charged by MDOT to go out and monitor speeds, the changes in operating speeds, so the 85th, the mean, the variance before and after, also looking at crash data before and after. So when the law went into place, we quickly mobilized to go out and collect speed data, and we used LiDAR to do that. So we've done our own speed data collection using LiDAR, but we've also relied on MDOT permanent traffic recorders, and they each have their own purpose. So LiDAR allows us to collect very detailed information about we're selecting the vehicles. So we know if there's a police officer out there, or there's road work out there, we know exactly what the conditions are, if it's raining, okay? But it also is a much more limited sample, right? So we're collecting a sample of 100 cars and as many trucks as we can get during that window, and we're moving on to the next site. The permanent traffic counters give us 24/7 data, but we don't know much about that data. We don't know why this traffic stream was traveling at 35 miles an hour at that particular location. Okay, so LiDAR is good for assessing driver speed selection. So kind of in a free flow sense, if I'm allowed to drive at a speed I want to drive at, LiDAR helps us to make that assessment. But the PTR is great for looking at general trends in travel speeds, nighttime speeds, that sort of thing. We're not collecting LiDAR data at night, obviously. So if we look at the before and after changes, the pre and post changes from April 17 to August of 17, and this is ongoing on an annual basis, but I just wanted to at least brief on the short-term changes. We saw on freeways where the limits went from 70 to 75, we saw about a 2 mile per hour change in the mean and 85th for passenger cars, and about a 2 to 3 mile per hour change, a 2 mile per hour change for the truck mean, and a 3 mile per hour change for the truck 85th. Now, what's even more important is if you look at the control sites where the speed limit did not change, so freeways like I-96 and I-94 in southern Michigan, portions of I-75 south of Bay City, no change in the operating speeds. The mean stayed flat and the 85th stayed flat. Now, of course, you say, well, look at the mean was almost 75, and this is at a location that before and after had a 70 mile per hour limit. So they're already a little bit on the high side, but it did not change. So there was no trickle over, no spillover effect at that point. Now, if we look at the trucks, there was a bit of a spillover effect, and the reason being is because the truck limit went up everywhere. Regardless of whether the sign was changed, the sign changes were rolled out over time for trucks. Now they all say 65, but even if on May 1st of 2017, the truck limit went from 60 to 65 on all limited access freeways. So there's no surprise why we're seeing an increase even on the control sites for trucks. Now, if we look at non-freeways where the speed limits went up from 55 to 65, so now a 10 mile per hour jump, well, we're seeing about double what we saw for the freeways. So approximately a 4 mile per hour increase for passenger cars and a 3.5 to 4.5 mile per hour increase for trucks. And we're seeing, actually on control sites, we're seeing some spillover. So the control sites we selected for non-freeways were actually generally the crossroads, the other M routes that were nearby. So maybe somebody's turning off of US 2 and onto M117 in the Upper Peninsula, and you're going from a 65 mile per hour to a 55 mile per hour limit, but they're still traveling at a higher rate of speed. So there was some trickle over effect. We'll of course monitor these over time. If you look at the permanent traffic recorders throughout the state, we're also seeing similar jumps. So again, this is more like aggregate, average, 24/7, 365 type data. And we are seeing we were seeing similar increase in both the average and the site-by-site average and also the 85th percentile. And I realize that this is a little bit difficult to digest, but if you just look at the overall trends, each and every site where the speed limit was increased saw an increase in the permanent traffic recorder speeds, both for the mean and the 85th, and was about 2 miles per hour. So very similar to what we saw for the LiDAR. For the non-freeways, similar again, about a 3 mile per hour increase in the average. And again, we can't distinguish between cars and trucks in this data. Okay, so similar trends. If we look in a time series sense to see if things actually stabilize, how things were on basically a day-by-day basis, we can see, so this is May 1 right here. So we can see an immediate jump on May 1 that the operating speeds, the mean and the 85th, did jump up and remained up. I don't know what was going on here, maybe some road work or something, but remained up, okay? Remained higher than the pre-increased speeds. And if we looked at a control site that was nearby, flat, okay? Non-freeway, same thing. Speed limit was changed on September 11th. You see about a 4 mile per hour jump here before and after September 11th. Nearby control site, flat. Yeah?
Did you correlate this with crash? Any hot zones?
Crash data is still ongoing. So no, we haven't. Sites were selected based on sites that had below average crash rates for total, severe, and fatals. For the most part.
I'm just wondering, for northern Michigan, with the large increase, there aren't any trauma hospitals, so you're going to have maybe less crashes, but they're going to be more
severe, yeah.
With more fatalities.
Right, and that's one thing that when you start digging deep into the data, so the 2018 data has just become available, like within a week. And the 2018 data will be where we'll start, because these occurred so late into 2017, we didn't have a full year's worth of data. So now we can actually start to look at full year's trends. We haven't been able to do that yet because it's just been so recent, so I haven't been able to update any of the data. But we are looking at that for MDOT. So it'll be interesting to look to see if at these locations, physics would tell you that if you're traveling 4 miles per hour greater, that especially at those high speeds, you're squaring the speed. If you think of kinetic energy, you're squaring the speed, so that'll have, if you were traveling previously at 70 and now your traffic stream is at 74, that should have an effect on the severity. it should shift to more high severity crashes. So that's was leading me to this, is that we are, and if we're looking at long-term trends, we're going to be performing a safety analysis, a long-term look at speed trends, crash frequency trends, crash severity trends. Other operational aspects are ongoing. We hope to have some information at TRB this year on the effect on passing behavior and queuing on two-lane highways. So if we're increasing the speeds for everybody from 55 to 65, is there less passing? Is there less queuing behind large trucks and on hills? Looking at the impacts on curves that might have been substandard. So if we had a 35 mile per hour curve and the limit was 55, our crash is occurring at a more frequent rate now that the limit's at 65, because certainly that curve was not realigned. I can guarantee you that. And then also the effects in work zones. That's all I have. The research reports that were performed in 2013, 14, and 15 that looked at the site selection process are available online. The before and after data analysis is ongoing, so we don't have anything report-wise formally right now. But I'd be happy to take questions.